Good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to the launch of the report from the 50+ Research Project. This project set out to explore the barriers and challenges faced by servicemen and servicewomen leaving the forces aged 50 or over. My name is Simon Allen. I'll be hosting this webinar today. It was originally intended to have a 3-hour event, including a panel discussion, but obviously current circumstances don't allow that. So we're doing a soft launch, namely this webinar. And we hope to follow up with employers, service leavers and other stakeholders later in the year. I'd like to introduce the people who are going to be appearing today. I've already mentioned myself. I'm the Chief Operations Officer of the Officers Association. I manage the research project on behalf of the OA. I'll be followed by Ray Locke, who's the Chief Executive of the Forces in Mind Trust, or FiMT. FiMT generously agreed to help fund the research. The main body of the report is going to be presented by Matt Flynn from the Centre for Research into the Older Workforce. He will present the highlights of the report, some of its key findings, and we'll take some questions at the end. And finally, Lee Holloway, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the OA, will wrap up and talk about the way forward. I'd like to explain how the project came about. Around 15,000 servicemen and servicewomen leave the armed forces every year. Of those, about 1,200 service leavers are aged 50 or over. Now, we all know that all service leavers face a big transition moving into the civilian world and finding civilian employment. However, we at the OA had found quite a lot of anecdotal evidence that older service leavers face particular challenges. Now, the challenges faced by older workers more generally has been widely recognised for some time. And we therefore turned to CROW, the Centre for Research into the Older Workforce, who obviously have expertise in this area, to conduct the research on our behalf, because we felt this was something that needed a further investigation. We then turned to the Forces in Mind Trust, as I mentioned earlier, to see whether they would help fund the project. And I'd like to hand over to Ray Locke, who will talk a little bit about why they decided to support this project.
Okay, thank you. My name is Ray Locke. I'm Chief Exec of the Forces in Mind Trust, and I'd just like to talk about why we're funding this research. And the slide, which I hope you can see, is the Forces in Mind Trust theory of change. And the theory of change that we're using is one that requires us to identify 6 outcomes that help towards successful, sustainable transition. And employment is a really important part of this. And the important aspect of employment is that if you get employment right, then it's likely that housing, health, finance, etc., they all follow on. So we've established the importance of employment. What Forces in Mind Trust likes to ask before we fund anything is, look, is there a problem here to be fixed? And the answer to that has already been answered in a sense when Simon mentioned that there was evidence to suggest that over 50s service leavers were disadvantaged. The next question we ask is, well, if we conduct a project, is there likely to come up with a solution? And I think Matt will talk to us about whether there is a solution. And then the final question, that's the most important one, is if there is a solution, is it actually going to be adopted by anybody? Yes, we believe there are things to be done, and you will listen over the next 45 minutes or so to what can be done. But if you fall within any of these organisations, if you're a business employer, if you're a member of the Ministry of Defence, and by that I include the frontline forces and everybody in the chain of command, or if indeed you yourself are an individual service leaver, then what this project is showing that there is something to be done. And so your time spent this morning, I think you will find will be very worthwhile indeed. And I'll let Lee conclude at the end of the session with actually what there is to be done, because there is plenty to be done. But before we find out that, let me hand over now to Matt, who will take us through the report findings.
Thank you, Ray. Okay, well, that's me, and that's the picture to my right is my co-author, Chris Ball. We're from the Center for Research into the Older Workforce. We've done quite a bit of research on how employers are managing and planning for an aging workforce. And this is a particularly important group that we're looking at in terms of the skills that they have, which are available to organizations. And it's important to remember within this context that the UK faces quite severe skill shortages. The projection is that over the next 10 years, there are about 6 million people with skills which are needed in the UK workforce. So there isn't really that much talent that can be wasted. I'll tell you a little bit about the project. Now, one of the things that you might notice in the report is that we use the term service leaver rather than the more popular term of veteran. And the reason for that is to focus on not just the individual, but also the transition. So we're looking at the experiences of people who have left the military at or after the age of 50. They've got a very long career in the military, and now they're coming into the civilian workforce. We did this by talking to 3 groups of people. First, of course, we wanted to talk to people who were in the process of transitioning out of the military to find out, for example, how prepared they felt for the transition, what their expectations were of the civilian workforce, what their expectations and aspirations were. But we also wanted to talk to people who had already gone through that process, who had already transitioned to the civilian workforce and maybe were on their second or third career. So looking at asking them to talk about their experiences retrospectively with the transition, but also what happened since then. The third group of people that we talked to were employers to get a feel from them about their perceptions of 50-plus service leavers. What do they value? What are some of the concerns that they have? What support do they need from organizations like the Career Transition Partnership, the MOD, charities like the Officers Association? The last thing that I need to emphasize as well is although this project is owned and managed by the Officers Association, we spoke to both ex-officers and people who had left in senior rank positions. So it was across the rank system that we spoke to people because there are very big differences when it comes to perceptions and skills which different groups of people have to offer once they leave the military. There were a couple of stages that we had for the project. First, we did a secondary analysis of existing data sets. So from the military side, we looked at 2 data sets, the UK Armed Forces Personnel Survey and the Career Transition Partnership Annual Survey. The first looks at the perceptions and expectations of people who are in the military, and there are a set of questions about what would persuade them to stay in the military and what would motivate them to leave. CTP's annual survey is an annual survey of people who have exited the armed forces to find out a little bit about their destination. So we had 2 sets of data looking at the experiences of service leavers, and we compared that with 2 data sets for the older workforce population as a whole to see if there were any big differences between service leavers and the general population. The second group of data was the English Longitudinal Survey on Aging and the Labor Force Survey. Now, I won't talk too much about the secondary analysis. You can read that in the report. But one of the big takeaways from this is that there's very little information about the destinations of people who count the service leavers, 50-plus service leavers, who count themselves as economically inactive. And there might be some need to gather some data on that. So, for example, do they consider themselves retired? Are they retired for ill health reasons, or simply because they just can't find a job in the civilian workforce? So after we did the secondary analysis, we conducted some focus group discussions with these three groups. And remember that the purpose of the focus groups were to triangulate the responses of the three groups of people. So for example, in speaking to people who were leaving the armed forces, how prepared do they feel in applying for jobs, in taking part in interviews, in networking, in presenting the skills that they had, but also then finding out the perspective from employers. Following the focus group discussions, we then had a survey of the three groups as well to take the data that we gathered through the focus group discussions and see how generalized they were across the population. So, for example, when it comes to employers, are there particular perspectives of organizations that are active when it comes to recruiting service leavers? And are those how different are they from the overall general population? I'll just move on here to say that one of the groundbreaking aspects of this project was to look at the experiences of people who leave the military after the age of 50. Now, there's already been quite a lot of research which has been done, both here in the UK and in the United States and around the world, on service leavers generally. How do employers perceive service leavers? What skills do they have that are marketable in the civilian workforce, and so forth. Myself and my colleagues have also done quite a lot of research on older workers. So how do employers think about their own older workforce, but also if an older job seeker came to them with an application for a particular post. Now, one way to address the questions which have been posed is simply to combine the two. And indeed, there are a lot of similarities, a lot of commonalities which 50-plus service leavers have with, say, service leavers and older people who have little or no experience in the military. But they still have some unique experiences, and that warrants an investigation of their own experiences in the civilian workforce. And I'll give you two examples of this. 50-plus service leavers are fairly unique in having long careers, but very little, if any, experience in the civilian job market. They rose through the ranks, they got promotions, training opportunities, and so forth in the military, in which career progression is very different. So once they leave the military, they're experiencing a very different environment to what they had before. The second very big uniqueness of this group is that they, in seeking a job, they lack what you might call a safety sector. So I work in academia. I've worked in academia for about 16 years. I might decide tomorrow that I want to do something very different. I might want to go into sales or into manufacturing or whatever else. I can then make that transition. I can make that leap to a new type of job, knowing that if I fail, if I don't get the job that I was hoping to, I could always go back to what I had done before. So I work for the University of Hull. I can maybe go to the dean of the business school on my hands and knees and beg them for my job back. Or even if I can't get a job from Hull, I can always get a job at another university. 50-plus service leavers don't have that luxury. Once they leave the military, they're pretty much in a new environment and there's no going back. The other big way in which 50-plus service leavers have different experiences from pretty much anybody else is that their career transition is part of an overall wider transition in their lives. So it's not just a change in career, it's also a change in their community, change in the culture that they live in. Sometimes there's a change in family circumstances, the networks change, and so forth. So they're having to negotiate and reconcile many changes in their lives, and careers, which would be a very big change in and of itself, is all part of an overall change in their environment. And I'll just read you a quote from one of the people that we spoke to, who was just going through that transition process. And he said the trapdoor, described the transition as the trapdoor suddenly being pulled, and I'm standing there naked and thinking, what the hell do I do now? Because the throttle was pushed so forward that I had not thought of the end. And if I did, I wouldn't have been able to do what I had effectively been able to do up until this point. Now, you might think that one of the ways to address this is to recognize the fact that 50-plus service leavers know that they're going to leave sometime before the age of 55, because 55 is the point at which they can start to draw their pension. And indeed, a lot of people do prepare for that a lot throughout their course of work in the military. In fact, one of the people that we spoke to described the military as the one organization which starts preparing you to leave from the day that you join. A lot of people that we talked to spoke very positively about their commanding officers, especially the last commanding officer that they had, and the support that they had in preparing for that transition. But there were also those who didn't feel terribly prepared. And indeed, those who had jobs with very high responsibilities or high pressure sometimes weren't able to gather all of the information about the skills and training that they had in order to prepare for the next stage. Now, we've got a short video here of one of the people that I spoke to, a guy by the name of Steve Harpham, who had gone through many career transitions, and he now finds himself in a job which really suits him quite well. And I'll let Steve talk a little bit about his own experiences.
And I spent 3 years working as a freelance trainer, management consultant. I did some disciplinary panel work as a lay member, which I still do, quite enjoy that, and started trying to build this portfolio career. But I think what happened was as that time went by, I increasingly realised that I'd not really done the foundation work, I'd not done the groundwork properly. And so I'd never really stopped and asked myself, you know, we might call it the Spice Girl question. Tell me what you want, what you really, really want. And when I stopped and thought about what do I really, really want, I realised kind of two things. One is I did want to work for somebody else because I missed being part of a team and I missed having a leadership contribution that I could make. And the other thing was the other thing I realised probably was that it's not about just getting a good job. It's about having a good life. And what does good look like for you? And yes, a good job is part of that, but it's not the only thing.
So I'll take you through some of the headline figures when it comes to what service leavers said were their experiences. First, very importantly, about a third of 50-plus service leavers said that they found their first job seeking, trying to find a secure job, difficult. That's a very big number, and it's a recognition that despite the plethora of support and skills development and training and so forth that they have available, a very big cohort still find it very difficult to do so. The next one on the lower left is very interesting, which it says that about 53% of service leavers said that they found a job before they left the military. In fact, another 8% said that they found a job within the first month of leaving the armed forces. Now that sounds great. You know, almost 2/3 of people 50-plus service leavers who left the military found a job fairly quickly. But that middle slide also contextualizes this, because although they found a job, it wasn't necessarily a job which made great use of the skills that they had. So there was a little bit of desperation there especially as they were getting to that point of transition. One of the big headline figures that we found was the extent to which people said that they'd experienced direct forms of discrimination, which could be either ageism, anti-military bias, or a combination of the two. About a third of the group altogether had experienced one or both. And we did find some examples of this, some quite direct examples, names like toy soldier or old knacker that people cited, but sometimes it was a misperception of service leavers. A good example of that is the idea that 50+ service leavers are quote unquote too regimented. And I talked to somebody who just left the military, and they said, well, listen, most of the time that we're in the military, we're having to go from one deployment to another. We go around the world. We have to deal with situations in which there's a lot of uncertainty. We're actually a lot more flexible than our civilian equivalents. The last thing I want to mention is in the survey, we asked 50+ service leavers what were the most important skills that they had. And we also asked employers, what are the skills that you're looking for jobs? And what was quite interesting there is that there's a little bit of a mismatch between the two. So for example, over a third of 50+ service leavers said that the most important skill that they had was leadership. But only 10% of employers said that that was the main thing that they were looking for. Now that doesn't mean that leadership isn't an important quality. And in fact, in an impressionist level, employers say that that is a very important skill. But how they market it is how 50+ service leavers market that skill is crucial to landing a job.
Naivety I'm talking about is because people come out having been in there a very long time, surrounded by like-minded people, and they're coming out, frankly, as innocents within this outside world. And the outside world is looking for has different values, and is looking for probably different qualities, but certainly qualities that will be described in a very different way. And that the obvious one of coming out with, I'm a retired major, I've got leadership qualities, etc., etc. If I'm on the other side of that fence, that's not necessarily directly what I'm looking for. They are perhaps supporting qualities. I'm probably looking to say, well, how many major projects, describe to me a major project that you've done. Now, if I think back to it, that never crossed my mind. I actually project managed closing an entire establishment and transferring the 3 functions of it to 3 other establishments, and that was a major project. But I was innocent. I didn't recognise what I had done and the skill sets that a prospective employer might have been looking for. So I think it's a two-way street, but it needs more of employers going and tasting what service life and service people are about.
How do employers perceive 50+ service leavers? Well, they recognize the fact that they have a lot of very important skills. Leadership, we just talked about. Logistics skills are very important, especially for organizations, obviously, in transportation, but also in manufacturing, in the service industry. There was a recognition of the importance of engineering skills and being able to transfer those skills to civilian type jobs. Project management seemed to be very important to organizations across sectors, and there was a recognition that people who are leaving the military have a lot of experience in managing very big projects, and they might have some skills which are then transferable to the civilian workforce. But it wasn't just skills which were important. There was also quite a lot of discussion about having the right attitude that organizations were looking for. So, for example, a good work ethic or camaraderie, which could then be translated to good team building. Managing uncertainty was very important. There was a recognition there that that service leavers had spent a lot of time managing situations in which they had limited information, and being able to make quick decisions at that point. And that was a skill and an attribute which was very important to organization.
Interesting about the networking, because what happens is you go to places like the National Health Service. There is no doubt, now that I sit on the inside of it, that ex-military officers have got huge amounts to offer the NHS. And the NHS are desperate for people with the skills that we've got. And yet, it almost feels to me like you're standing there going, excuse me, here I am with my little clipboard with all my great skills and, can we have a chat? And they're going, excuse me, I'm looking for some really great candidates and kind of in my way, So it's this bizarre trying to make that connection. And that's where the networking comes, because if you're not too aggressive about it, but you are working in the areas that you want to be in, one day someone says, as indeed happened in my case, I know that you're looking for someone, would you like to talk to this friend? So once you meet someone face to face and you make that connection, that risk of, I don't know who this person is, but he's got very shiny shoes and short haircut, and I'm almost certain he's going to do a lot of shouting. And as soon as you meet them and get past that, it just all drops into place, really, doesn't it?
And what are some of the examples of good practice that organizations are taking? Well, some organizations have service peer mentors to help, especially 50-plus service leavers who don't have that much experience in the civilian workforce in terms of settling in to a new role and into a new culture, being able to make that transition of a mindset to a new environment. Some organizations are using HR practices which have been applied to other groups, especially university leavers, to people who are leaving the military. So you might have, for example, job trials or milk rounds in which people can take, in which service leavers can enjoy some experiences in different roles to see what they're best suited for. Very important for people who don't have a set plan when they leave the military, what they want to do in the civilian world. We had some examples of community groups, such as, for example, the Veterans Hub up in Hull, of job clubs for peer-to-peer support, so people who are undergoing the same experiences can support one another. One organization that we talked about the importance of bridge jobs, especially if people weren't quite sure where they were going. They needed a cushion, they needed a period of time to manage their career trajectory. So they might have a period of time in which they're working for that organization. It was a logistics company. They provided training, they provided, for example, support in terms of getting HGV licenses in order to give them that cushion so that they can, not only the cushion, but also working with other people who are also leaving the military so that they can make decisions on where they want to go next. The last thing I mentioned, which was kind of controversial, was the idea of guaranteed job interviews. The idea behind that is that if you if a 50-plus service leaver meets all of the criteria, the essential criteria for a job, they would be guaranteed at least an interview. At least they would be able to sit in front of the manager and talk about their experiences and skills. Some 50-plus service leavers didn't really think this was great, and they thought this was maybe a signal of special treatment. But others thought it was a very effective tool of at least getting their foot in the door and being able to present themselves to managers in a new organizational sector. They also thought it was very important in terms of getting some experience in going through the interview process.
That skill set that people come out with is really useful in the commercial world. The difficulty is people actually taking those skills and being able to articulate those at the right sort of level. Where I think FTM has really helped has been preparing people to enable them to step into those interviews and to step into those roles and into those jobs.
So here are the broad set of recommendations that we gave in the report. And of course, the report goes through these in more detail. One is more civilian career planning before leaving the armed forces. Now, Lord Ashcroft, who carried out a very big review of military transitions across the life course, emphasized the importance of service people maintaining personal development portfolios. So every time they got a new skill, every time they got a new set of training, new experience, they'd be able to document it so that they would have this folder, this big binder, which they can, once they left the military, they could then go to employers and present all of the skills that they acquired in the military. But it's not, as I said, just about a documentation of skills. It's also having an understanding about the direction that they're going. And this was a very big theme that came out in talking to service leavers, especially those who had left a long time ago, and the journey that they took in arriving to something which suited their skills, values, expectations, and lifestyles. The next issue was the smoothing of the transition from military service to civilian work, and being able to more effectively transition out. And it's important to remember that about 2/3 of people have landed a job before or just after they left the military. We had some people who talked about missing out on opportunities because they were still in that transition process. The transition out of the military is about 2 years. So if somebody within the first month or so after they've notified their commanding officer that they're leaving, find that have secured a job, they might lose out on that opportunity because the employer doesn't have the capacity to wait that long. There might be some flexibility that could be introduced to support people who find a job early to maybe phase out of the military service into a civilian job. Advocating for 50+ service leavers. There's a great network called the Armed Forces Covenant, which is a network of employers and other stakeholders who have committed to supporting service leavers in finding civilian jobs which suit them. Now, not every organization is part of the Armed Forces Covenant, but not everyone needs to as well. There are a lot of organizations, such as small businesses, which can benefit from the skills that 50+ service leavers have. So you remember I talked about one of the key attributes that this group has is being able to manage uncertainty. Now, isn't that a great skill that small businesses could use, especially in a time like this, because it's very difficult to manage the uncertainty of economic and social upheavals like we're experiencing today. The last thing that we recommended were a set of recommendations concerning those who aren't in traditional work. They might have become self-employed, might be portfolio workers, they might be in a precarious work situation in which they don't have a secure contract of employment. Indeed, there are also those, a relatively large cohort of people, 50+ service leavers, who are long-term unemployed, who haven't been able to get their career back on track. There's quite a lot that can be done to support that group as well.
I think you've got that dedication. These people have got a really good mindset, and they've got lots of skills that are very transferable. 50 is not old. Yeah. I don't think so. The retirement age is expanding. They've got a lot to give.
So those are the major findings of the report. I welcome questions that the audience might have, and I'll hand it back to Simon.
Thank you very much, Matt. The first question is based on your experience working with Crow and looking at the older workforce. Do you think that having a service background puts you at a greater disadvantage when looking for employment at age 50+, when compared to civilian counterparts changing jobs or careers?
Employers speak very positively about 50-plus service leavers, and on an impressionist level, they recognize the fact that this group has a lot of very good skills and attributes which could be used in the organization. What puts them at a real disadvantage is the lack of what I termed before the safety sector. If you don't have experience in a particular sector, most of the time you're going to be at a disadvantage from those who do have it. So we talked to a lot of 50-plus service leavers who were quite disappointed when they found that the person who might have gotten a job that they were seeking had less training or less experience or fewer skills than they had, but they had experience in the sector. And that's because employers are sometimes very risk averse when it comes to making decisions. People don't want to think outside the box if they don't have to, because they need to justify the decisions that they've made. And this puts 50-plus service leavers at somewhat of a disadvantage compared to older workers.
Thank you very much, Matt. I've got a question from Sean Taylor, who's asked, do the panel think that the current crisis will create an opportunity for the 50-plus individuals to be steady hands, especially as younger leavers find a different way to work in different industries out of choice? And we could also bring in one of the other panelists as well, but what are your initial thoughts?
My thought is that the current situation highlights a lot of the positive skills and attributes which 50-plus service leavers have right now. They played a very important role in helping the government manage the current crisis, being involved in the construction of the Nightingale Hospital, but also in supporting organizations in adapting to the new situation. So you think of service leavers in logistics, helping to get supermarket shelves filled, but also small businesses, as mentioned before, in helping them manage that uncertainty. So I think this highlights some of the key attributes that this group has.
Lee, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I was very much thinking along the same lines as Matt. One thing the current situation, the COVID-19 situation has done is shown how military personnel in general are adept at stepping outside their established and trained skill set. So they're demonstrating incredible amounts of flexibility as well as a willingness to take personal risk. And I think that's going to count for a lot over the next couple of years as we review the situation that we've been in. It can only benefit those leaving the military because the personal credibility of military personnel both serving and leaving, in my view, has gone up exponentially over the past 6 weeks or so.
Thank you very much, Lee. This is a more general question asked by a couple of people, actually, and that is the connotations of and the pros and cons of being referred to as service leaver instead of a veteran. Did you pick up anything from that in your interviews or focus group discussions, Matt? And then I might ask Ray or Lee to mention if they have any thoughts.
Well, the term service leaver is something that we use as a self-marker to ensure that we're keeping the focus on people who make the transition after the age of 50. Focus group participants use both terms interchangeably. So it didn't seem to make terribly much of a difference. And
how about you, Ray?
Yeah, so we've done a lot of research into public perception, and there's no doubt, and we've got lots of YouGov data on this, that when you mention veteran to the general public, then they have in mind the Captain Tom type of veteran, i.e. a very distinguished gentleman, usually wearing a blazer with medals and a beret. And of course, on the one hand, picking up on what Lee said, that it's fantastic that the likes of Captain Tom have shown, at one level, what veterans can do for society. But at the other time, it does reinforce people's ideas that a veteran does equal a Second World War veteran. So consistently, we try and avoid using the expression veteran and use ex-service person. And indeed, we've also got research elsewhere that shows a lot of the younger members of the armed forces, as they leave in their late 20s, early 30s, they certainly don't consider themselves to be veterans at all. And we've had a number of health questions where people have been asked if they're veterans and said, oh, no, I'm not a veteran. And so they haven't accessed service. So it is a very difficult term. The reason we use ex-service person, I think, therefore, is straightforward. Service leaver is interesting because for us, we use it as it conjures up this this time in your life where you are in transition from military to civilian service. And so a service leaver for us, and I think this is largely where this piece of research has been focused, has been on that initial couple of years as you come out of the military. So I think it's a useful term, but as ever, together with veteran, it can be interpreted very differently by different audiences, and understanding how it's different is really the most important thing.
Thank you, Ray. I've got a question here from James Hancock. He said that the MOD approach to career transition is rank-based rather than age or experience or expectation, or indeed needs-based. Matt, was this something that came up in your research?
Yes. In terms of getting a promotion, the way it was described was in the military. You don't necessarily go for a promotion. You're recommended for promotion. Recommended for a higher rank, and this then conditions the way in which once 50+ service leavers have left the military and they're looking for jobs in the civilian workforce, this conditions the approach that they take in engaging with employers. So some talked about how it was that they struggled with presenting putting their best foot forward and presenting what they had to offer the employer. This was manifest, for example, in terms of how CVs were written. So sometimes talked to employers who said that the CVs that they were receiving from service leavers were sometimes indecipherable, but then service leavers saying, well, I'm not really sure how I can present the best case here because I don't have that experience in showcasing what I have to offer employers.
Thank you very much. Now I've got a question which I think Clive Lowe, if he is available, might be able to throw some light on. Clive is the Employment Services Deputy Director for the Officers Association, but he's also got a very strong background in careers consultation, supporting service leavers and people subsequent to leaving the forces. And the question is from Edward Evely, and he says, I think your Spice Girls point rings very true. I've wasted time going for too many roles, but it's hard to see measures of success that suggest where one should focus. And it's the lack of these signals of success which is the hardest to deal with. Do you have any thoughts?
Hi, Simon. Yes. Thank you for the question. It's quite a tough one, Matt. One of the things that we suggest as career consultants in the OA is that if you have the time to come visit us, we will talk through these issues that you are likely to face. Ideally, you should visit us some time before you are finally due to leave the services, and then have a look at what are your particular skill sets. What are those skills that you have which are readily transferable into the outside market? And the career consultant can help and advise on that. And then to focus on those when you start approaching the marketplace. And it really is about what do you really, really want to do. And what you really, really want to do is probably the thing that you are most, that you excel at mostly. And putting those two together does actually work. When you go out into the marketplace, or when you are in your final transition, we do recommend that you speak to your network of ex-colleagues, those who've already preceded you into the outside market. And they will also give you advice and help in what direction, what sort of organizations, what sort of roles you should be approaching. This is quite difficult for those who are based overseas, and this is one of the questions that's also been posed. When you're overseas, it's very hard to tap into your UK-based network. So we do recommend that if you are based overseas for your last tour, that you try to get over to the UK, set yourself up some networking meetings, have a chat with people. Traditionally, it's over coffee. Currently, of course, we're social distancing. But to have a chat with colleagues who've made the transition, and they will support you and give you advice in the direction you want to go.
Ray again, just picking up on what success looks like. We did a report a couple of years ago called Benefit Not Burden. It's on our website if anyone wants to look at it. And we asked a number of people who had recently left the armed forces as to what they viewed successful employment would look like. And there's some very interesting results. And a lot of things were negative. I don't want to commute. I don't want to have to be crushed in a London tube. I don't want to have to spend nights away from bed when I've spent the last 20 years doing that. But I would echo what Clive said about sitting down and actually really with your family, and that's important, understanding to you what success looks like, because I think it's one of those things that nobody can tell you what success looks like. You can only judge that for yourself. And in terms of where and when and how you look for employment, again, we've just released a report, interesting report from Good People, that highlights the real difficulties with the sort of the CV job notice board process. And we wonder whether there are more innovative ways of going about this job matching. I think, if anything, the sort of remote working that we've gone through over the last 6 weeks, I think is going to heighten that. We always used to say there was a barrier, literally a wire between people who had left the services and those who were still in them. And very rare was it that ideas and experiences were shared across the wire. I think, if anything, again, this is an opportunity for us to break down those barriers.
Thank you very much, Ray. I've got a question here. If ageism was anticipated by service leavers, I'd be interested to know what strategies they apply to avoid this or deal with this. Did this come up in your discussions, as particularly from those people who had been out of the military for a year or two, Matt?
Yes, they did talk about strategies they took. Ageism directly was not something which everybody experienced. And in fact, they talked about this more as misperceptions of their experiences up until this point. So it wasn't just, that they felt that they were going to be, that they anticipated being discriminated against because they would be considered too old for a job, but more about their place as somebody who spent a lot of time in the military, and perceptions of being quote unquote too regimented, or having a particular way of working and so forth. Some overcompensated for that. So, they made a point of if they were on a job trial, making sure that they got coffees for everybody, and offering to take on new jobs and so forth. Some focused on their key attributes. What do I really have to offer this organization, and then trying to align it to what the business needed. But it was a very big challenge, and there was a recognition there that they were coming into these organizations as outsiders, and trying to fit in was a very big challenge.
Thank you very much. What I'd like to do is hand over to Lee Holloway, who's CEO of the Officers Association, who's going to wrap up and talk about possible ways we could take this research forward.
So thank you very much, Simon. First of all, we have a thank you from Johnny Mercer MP, who's the Minister for Defence, People and Veterans. So as Johnny says, they'll be using this report to see how they can best advantage or use it to the best advantage towards those people aged 50 plus who leave the military and transition into civilian life. And we'll be pushing as hard as possible to see that this report is used by the Office of Veteran Affairs appropriately. Now, as Simon said, it's up for me to wrap up. A couple of things that I spotted early on. First of all, I spotted was Ray's slide, which made three things quite clear. There are things that the corporate organisations can do more. There are things that the MOD can do more, and the things that the service leaders can do more. And some are rather more difficult than the others, in my opinion. The corporate one is particularly the most challenging, because we have a very diversified and very complex industrial base, and getting the message out to all the various sectors and potentially interested parties is no easy matter, and that's something that we will have to try and figure out in the communications plan. But that is probably the most difficult, to get them to recognise the experience and skills and availability of the service leavers, and to use it to the best advantage. At the end of the day, in our opinion, the opinion of the Officers Association, there's a huge ability here to enhance the business case of any individual organisation. The Ministry of Defence, now that can always do more, but the Ministry of Defence at the end of the day is rather less inflexible than most. Now, the Ministry of Defence's official channel to help those transitioning from military careers to civilian occupations is the CTP. The CTP, as was pointed out by one person, tends to be very rank-based. Well, the CTP is actually rank agnostic, which is good and it's bad. It's good in the way that it's fair. Nobody by virtue of their rank should be entitled to any more than anybody else. However, it's a fact of life that a Rear Admiral, an Air Vice Marshal, or a General might want slightly different advice to that of somebody who's leaving as a Sergeant, to the benefit of both of them. But the CTP is rank agnostic, and everybody gets, broadly speaking, the same capability. But maybe the Ministry of Defence could do more to make this just a little bit more flexible when they award the next CTP contract in about 4 or 5 years' time. I do think the Ministry of Defence could do more for the person, any person departing the military, in being more flexible in when they leave, the notice they're given, the terms of their release, and so on. It's very difficult sometimes to say that you're leaving the military in 6 months' time and trying to apply for a job which is going to ask you how much notice you've got to give, and they want somebody within 3 months. In some cases, the Ministry of Defence is flexible. In some cases, it's not. I think that itself could be possibly reviewed, and we can do, as the Officers Association can do as much as possible to influence that. Service leavers, what can you do more? I don't think I can add more than the advice that's already been given. Use what's out there. Use the Officers Association, use other organisations, White Ensign Association, the CTP, and use your community. The network, the community of networks that's springing up, identified by the Officers Association, is extremely valuable, and it's the best thing you can do. And as a side, I would always say, always have a copy of your CV with you, always. If I then look at the recommendations made by Matt, is one of them is career planning on exit. Yeah, that is all about getting ready, but the view as to when one should start this, the CTP looks after you 2 years before and 2 years after. Should you start before? In my opinion, you should start having a CV from the very first few years of your military career. The Ministry of Defence do encourage, the various branches of the military do encourage a career development plan, I agree, but you should be developing your CV as early as possible and turning it into civilian speak as early as possible. Not every employer understands what a brigade is, or a company is, or a company sergeant, or whatever. You've got to civilianise what you've got. Support for self-employed, those in precarious workers and unemployed. Interesting. There is support for self-employed available. We work closely with an organisation called Ex-Forces, which is very effective at helping self-employed. When it comes to the precarious workers, that's more, I think, I would be looking to government institutions such as the Office for Veterans Affairs to assist in that. The unemployed, well, that's particularly where charities such as the Officers Association and the Regular Forces Employment Agency come into our own. We don't seek to make anything from beneficiaries, we seek to assist beneficiaries, and those beneficiaries sometimes are those who are the most hardest, most difficult to assist in getting employment. That's what we're here for, and if necessary, that's where we will concentrate. So what I've laid out in this slide here is we will be developing a communications plan so that the stakeholders most termed as valid to this report receive a copy of the report. We must identify the best communication channels by which we can distribute the report and make sure that the key action points are followed up. We'll also be looking for to identify clear areas where we can collaborate. So we've got everything from the Institute Directors to the Ministry of Defence, the Office of Veterans Affairs, other charities in the sectors, and so on, as well as various corporate institutions. So we will identify those and again make sure that the report is passed on. Some ideas for next steps. We could have an employers forum. Very much, I would think we'd have to put some detail on this, but invite employers to come forward and form a fairly reasonably sized panel for you, those over 50s who are looking to find employment, and see if we can get their views and their input, and we can put questions to them as to why they do or do not support the employment of over 50s military personnel. We could have a partner workshop, again more detail required on that, but it'd be good to identify those entities which would be interested in partnering with the Officers Association or like-minded organisations to carry this forward. And perhaps a webinar event for the over 50s community itself. I think that's a particularly good idea, especially if I could involve, or the OA could involve, some employers and perhaps members of the Ministry of Defence and somebody from the Office of Veterans Affairs. So that is definitely something that we will look into. Finally, I would like to give my personal thanks to Ray Locke and FiMT for supporting the Officers Association in putting together this report. We couldn't do it without FiMT, and I've found that in the 7 years I've been in the job that FiMT has been particularly a particularly valuable asset to the charity sector when it comes to helping us to educate the people we need to educate and what's needed. That's welcome, Ray. I mean that sincerely. And Matt, thank you to you and your organisation for compiling the report. Very well done. So thank you to you all, and thank you to Simon for putting this together. And I think that would be about it from me.
Thank you very much, Lee. The project launch is now concluding, as Lee mentioned. We are putting a number of resources onto our website. You can see the link to the page on the website there, and there'll be a page specifically dedicated to the 50+ project. This includes the project report, which is quite large, an executive summary, which is somewhat more digestible, and an infographic as well. As I said earlier, I think the level of interest that's been shown here indicates that there is scope, as Lee mentioned, for a 50+ forum in which we could discuss this further. And thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today. I hope you found it helpful and worthwhile. And we look forward to hearing from you in some other way at some point in the future.